So this week, we learned that the NFL and its players are working on a new way to fight for social justice together. Owners and players potentially could agree that maybe the league will contribute up to $100 million to causes selected by the players themselves. Now, the thing is, this is not a done deal yet, and it also explicitly isn't laid out in the deal, but owners and maybe the league hoping that this initiative might help end some of the players' game day protests that we've been covering so often. Which brings us to our next guest, Tyrone Beeson, staff writer for Seattle Times Pacific Northwest Magazine. Such a fascinating cover story in this weekend's magazine. You wrote it. It's all about protests and sports. So high level, kind of tell us a little bit about why you wanted to write this piece.
Well, this is not a new story, right? What fascinated me about it was that it's a very old one. It goes well back in time. And I think it's really interesting that 50 years ago, this year really, you had protests by athletes like Muhammad Ali, who of course refused to be drafted to go fight in Vietnam. And you had in 1968 the Mexico City Olympics with the two track stars putting up the Black Power fist. And so I wanted to put this into some cultural context, that what we're seeing here with the anthem protests, whether it's sitting or taking a knee or locking arms, it's part of a long tradition of athletes using, as I say in the story, the level playing fields of sports really to address imbalances in society. So I wanted to kind of redraw the focus to those issues, and because it has sort of gotten sidetracked and become a discussion about whether these players are respectful to the flag and to the country. But to me, there's a much greater outrage, which is the injustice that these guys and a lot of women athletes have been trying to draw attention to.
What do you think hasn't been said up to this point in this debate that you really felt needed to be said?
Well, I think that what we have to remember as journalists is when we do stories like this, to remind our audiences that protest is essential to the American experience and to one's ideas about patriotism. And so I think that these athletes are actually expressing a kind of love of country that calls on all of us to pay attention to issues that they find that are most important to them in their lives once they take off the uniforms. And this is a very important and personal issue for a lot of these players, most of whom are African American, And I think that I wanted to make sure that people drew a line, a very direct one, between protesting for justice and loving one's country. Because I think, again, the conversation has gotten a little bit sidetracked, and they have been accused of not respecting the flag or the military or the police. And a lot of these folks have military and police officers in their own families. So they know very well what it is to love those institutions and to want to nurture them and to make sure that they that those institutions also participate in providing justice for people who haven't had them historically.
One interesting thing, I think, is exactly what you just said, the historic aspect of it. You mentioned at the beginning of this interview, you really lay out this idea that, like, at the time, historically, the similar reaction to these protests. But then in the rearview mirror, we're like, well, of course they did this. Do you think that's how we'll look back on now?
It takes a little time. I mean, it may take 40 or 50 years, but I think in the end, we'll see that these players are doing something really, really important in a positive way. They're calling it on us again to make sure that we all get to enjoy the rights and freedoms that we say that we are so proud of in this country and that are embodied in the anthem and in the flag. And it may, again, I think right now the situation is so hot and so contentious that it's a little bit difficult to see that. But again, I think it's important for us to keep writing stories about it to remind people of the bigger picture.
I've read this. It's worth your time. I promise. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you.
It's online right now. And if you want to pick up the print edition of it, it's also in this weekend's magazine. Tyrone Beeson, thank you very much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate it very much. Go out and read it. Back to you guys.